everybody, it's Nick Astor. I'm excited to be with Joel Glanzburg. Joel is an applied naturalist and the founder of Regenesis and PatternMind. Joel, applied naturalist, what does that mean?
Applied naturalist is really about understanding how living systems work. And everything on this planet is a living system, whether it's an organization or an organism, and applying that to what we do as human beings. So thinking like nature works.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that's in the same family of thought as something like biomimicry? Is that what we're talking, or is it different?
Well, I think biomimicry has mostly focused on how do we look at the forms and structures in nature and imitate those, as opposed to looking at the patterns of processes of living systems and how do we engage in the same patterns of processes or the same ways of shifting patterns of processes. So life is all about process, right? And so it really is, are we following a mechanized pattern? Are we following an evolutionary pattern?
Mm-hmm. And can you give us an example of some of your work where you've been able to take some of these patterns, if you will, and apply them to something practical, something useful for us to live by?
In many communities we've focused on the built environment, and that architects and engineers and others are really focused on how do we redesign buildings. And one of the things we've begun to do is change the entire process of how buildings come about. So how do we engage with the community, the human and non-human community, the watersheds and the wildlife and the plant and animal communities, and see what small changes would help those systems to come to greater health, instead of simply how would we try to make something happen. So a very simple example here from the Southwest, there's a man named Bill Zedike who's been working on watersheds for a long time, and he's done a lot of work around small changes in streams that help the stream to restore itself instead of building large structures or physically restoring the stream. Right? Mm-hmm. We see similar things in our own lives.
Now that's interesting, because a lot of people, even folks that might be thinking that they're, designing a building in a quote unquote green way, may still be thinking only about the building itself, the materials of the building itself, stick some solar panels on, pow, there you go. But you're talking about a much deeper connection. You mentioned watersheds, you mentioned the community that the building is sited in.
Yes, well, as I said, everything on this living planet is a living system. So all living systems follow the same patterns. And it's one of the beauties of patterns is that they apply across scale and media. The galaxy spirals just like the hair on top of our head, right? And so one of the primary patterns in living systems is this one of ecological succession, moving from one level of ecosystem to another, to another, to another. And how do we look at whatever system we're working with, whether it's a business or a school or a city, and look for the small interventions that can help bump it up to another level of development, of evolution. And a lot of it is simply beginning with seeing all of those things, whether they're watersheds or the geology or the economy, as part of one single living whole, as opposed to focusing on fragments.
Joel, we're excited to have you in San Francisco at our event in May. And I understand that Carol Sanford is going to do a bit of an onstage interview with you, which I think is going to be terrific. Can you give us a sneak preview of what we might hear from you then?
Sure. So a lot of my work as an applied naturalist is based on this oldest of human arts and skills of tracking. And we can track animals, we can track geology, we can track whatever process it is. And at Regenesis, we've developed this whole thing we call story of place, or a storing of place process. So how do we actually become aware about how the unique places we're working work, so we can work well with them, so we can develop a beneficial relationship with them, as opposed to an ignorant, destructive relationship like we mostly have with the living world, human and non-human communities. So Carol and I are going to talk about that, share some stories of examples of what we've done in the past, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and how those unique people and places and beings function.
We're very excited to see this come together. And Joel, thanks so much for taking a few minutes to sit down with me.
All right. Thank you, Nick. Look forward to more.